Welcome to the first edition of Extraordinary Stories podcast, this time in English. You come to know this podcast in Polish, but from now on I will be doing some of the parts in English as well. And without much further ado, let me introduce my first guest. I'm really proud to introduce to you Professor Paul Offit, renowned inventor of one of the vaccines, pediatric vaccines, and we'll be explaining this later. Also a published author of several medical narratives, and also an author of and co-author of more than 150 scientific publications. I'm really glad and privileged that you accepted this invite, sir. And let me start the question from the pediatric vaccines angle. We come to know that pediatric vaccines go through a thorough investigation process. And that was the case for instance, in the rotavirus vaccine that you've invented. So the vaccine for rotavirus. And right now, we know that there is a COVID vaccine approved for children as old as 5 years old and obviously older. And some people may have questions about whether this was thorough enough, having in mind how long this process took in the case of recent vaccines. So can you elaborate on this, please?
Well, I think it's understandable to be somewhat hesitant. It is. I mean, I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, and for the vaccines for the 5 to 11-year-old, which we just approved, that was a 2,400 child study. So there were 1,600 children in the vaccine group. There were 800 children in the placebo group. There were 16 cases of COVID in the placebo group and 3 in the vaccine group. That meant that the vaccine was 91% effective. But, some people thought, really? You only want to do 2,400 children? When you studied this vaccine, Pfizer's mRNA vaccine in adults, you did a study of 40,000 adults. Why are we doing so few children? And I do understand that at some level, but exactly how big is the human price that you want to pay for knowledge? So, for example, instead of doing a 2,400 child study, we could have done a 24,000 child study, in which case there wouldn't have been 16 cases of COVID in the placebo group. There would have been 160 children who suffered COVID unnecessarily. So I think we know enough at this point to say that this vaccine is safe and effective, because the big difference is when we made our Rototech vaccine, our rotavirus vaccine to protect babies, we did, as you note, a 70,000 person study in babies. But what we didn't have was we didn't have hundreds of millions of adults or adolescents that had already received the vaccine. So you do have much more knowledge about this vaccine in general as you move down to the younger age groups than we ever have typically for any pediatric vaccine.
I think the second question that comes from the vaccine hesitancies group is the question about pregnant women, because we hear OBGYNs talking about the possibility or even the recommendation to vaccinate pregnant women, whereas in the past, for the past vaccines, that was not the case. So this is another probably feature why people are wondering whether it is really a safe approach.
Right. So when this vaccine was studied, in the 2 mRNA vaccines were studied, and then we approved them in December of last year. Pregnant women weren't studied. You weren't allowed to be part of the study if you were pregnant. And although there were about 3 dozen instances of pregnancy during the study, that wasn't a lot. Now, normally when a vaccine is approved, like this one was, the CDC, if they see that pregnant women weren't studied, they'll say that the vaccine is contraindicated for use in pregnant women. But they didn't do that here. What they said here was that a pregnant woman could reasonably choose to get a vaccine. The reason they said that is that they knew that pregnant women were 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be hospitalized or to go to the ICU or die than were women of the same age who weren't pregnant. In other words, SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID, is more serious in pregnant women than it is in women of the same age who aren't pregnant. So what they said instead of contraindicated, that you can't get it, they said a pregnant woman could reasonably choose to get the vaccine. And so thousands did. then tens of thousands did. And so then the CDC could look, they could compare pregnant women who received the vaccine with pregnant women who didn't receive the vaccine to see if there was any difference in the outcome of pregnancy, any problem with the fetus during pregnancy, or any problem with the newborn once the child was born, and found that there were no differences, that there was no difference in fetal outcome or pregnancy outcome if you'd gotten the vaccine or if you hadn't gotten the vaccine. So with that, the CDC changed its recommendation and said that the vaccine is recommended for pregnant women. Just in the last few weeks in the United States, there's been an increase in pregnant women who've been hospitalized, gone to the intensive care unit, been put on ventilators, delivered their babies prematurely. So the CDC changed its recommendation again now that pregnant women are urgently recommended to receive this vaccine.
Okay, so one last question to this streak is about Rotoshield. Because that was the pediatric vaccine that was approved and it was allowed on the market. Obviously, it was many, many years back, but that's still interesting case. And it was withdrawn from the market, actually, because when studied on the larger group, post-marketing, it turned out that there are some serious adverse events related to these vaccines. Are we sure, after all the results that we've seen so far, and obviously the large groups that you explained, that there won't be some serious findings later on in the process?
Well, historically, for the last 200 years, ever since the first smallpox vaccine, certainly vaccines can cause serious problems, can cause problems that cause permanent harm, can cause fatalities. I think any medical product that has a positive effect can have a negative effect, including a severe negative effect. But if you look at the severe problems associated with vaccines, they invariably occur within 6 weeks of a dose. And that's why it's recommended in the United States that all vaccines be studied for at least 2 months after the last dose. Now that's not necessarily going to pick up a very, very rare side effect. I mean, so for example, if you look at the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a vectored virus vaccine, that vaccine in the study that was done initially as a single dose vaccine was a study of more than 40,000 people, and there was not a problem that was found. But when it was given to millions of people, tens of millions of people, it was found to be a rare cause of clotting, including severe clotting, including clotting in the brain. And that was extremely rare. It occurred in roughly 1 per 500,000 cases. So you were never going to pick that up in a pre-licensure study or a pre-approval study. But it was picked up once it was already authorized. Now, again, it's a kind of a problem that occurred within a couple weeks of getting a dose. So it's not like there are long-term problems. In other words, I can't think of a single example of a vaccine where, it looked to be fine. It was given to hundreds of millions of people. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, there was found to be a problem. If there's going to be a problem, it's virtually immediate. And the reason is you're making an immune response initially that peaks at about, 10 days, 14 days after a dose, and then starts to come down. And then if you get a second dose, then it'll peak again in about 7 days, 10 days, then it'll start to come down, the immune response. So if you're going to see a problem, usually that's immunologically mediated, you'll see it, within a couple months of any dose.
What we are seeing right now, a lot of physicians are taking the role of educators, and quite rightly so, of course, about vaccination and the role of it in fighting the COVID epidemic. But we also witnessing right now in Europe, or also in Poland, a lot of hostility towards those physicians and even the threats. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that actually you come across this kind of behavior some 20 years ago. So you've been receiving threats for many, many years. Are they subdued now in a way, or how you're coping with it? Is there any coping mechanism that you would like to introduce to your colleagues from Europe and Poland, how to deal with that kind of issues?
Denial. I work on a lot of denial. I think I think the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement began in the early 1980s with the concern that the whooping cough vaccine, the pertussis vaccine, could cause permanent brain damage. That wasn't true, but that was really the birth of it. But yeah, I think what surprises me the most about the current pandemic is that the anti-vaccine activity is as vigorous as it is and as successful as it is. In the United States, there's at least 60 million people who haven't been vaccinated. Many of them haven't been vaccinated because they've chosen not to be vaccinated, because they've been influenced by this disinformation campaign that's been propagated by the anti-vaccine movement. I always thought that if you had a situation like this one, where in the United States, 750,000 people have died. I mean, 750,000 people have died in this country. I mean, millions and millions have been hospitalized. Everyone has been touched by this virus. This virus has brought us to our knees. I mean, it's caused massive joblessness, massive homelessness, food insecurity, domestic violence, child abuse. It's just a nightmare. You would think that vaccines, which are clearly our ticket out of this pandemic, would be seen that way and wouldn't be attacked as being, harmful, and where the anti-vaccine movement does what it normally does, which is create these false beliefs. Vaccines affect fertility, or vaccines negatively affect your DNA, or can alter your DNA, or vaccines cause you to be magnetic, or vaccines are toxic, or whatever it was. You would think that would have disappeared in the face of this massive international tragedy. But it hasn't. And that's really what surprises me the most. I would have never predicted that.
Yeah, but what about those threats? I mean, is this a serious situation? I mean, in the United States, we've been seeing actually abortion clinics being blown up. So you'd think that you should probably take some of them at least seriously. Is there any way to distinguish between the threats that are just being thrown off and the threats that are serious?
Yes, there's actually the FBI actually has criteria for this, and they will get involved if you meet these three criteria. One is that the threat is specific. In other words, that the person doesn't just say, watch your back. Rather, what they say is, I'm going to come to your office and shoot you with a gun or something like that. Two is that it's done more than once. And three, it's that it's done by someone who they think could do it. They think could possibly do that because they have the kind of personality makeup that would allow them to do it, like a paranoid schizophrenic, for example. When that happens, and that's happened 3 times in my life, the FBI will get involved. They will. And what they'll do is they'll monitor the person who's made the threats, monitor them to see whether or not that they've bought any weapons, monitor them to see whether or not they are going to be traveling to your area. They do look at that person. By the way, your notion of civil liberties dramatically changes once you're threatened. My attitude about people's civil liberties is violate their civil liberties if they threaten me. I'm fine with that. But I really don't think that's going to happen where someone would hurt me. I don't. They've threatened me. They've threatened my children, but they have never carried out on the threat. I think at their heart, they're cowards. They're just trying to make you shut up. They're trying to get you to stop talking. And this is the way they do it. I don't think they'll physically harm me. I don't.
Yeah,
but again,
I think, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I really admire your stamina here, actually. But I think what's different right now between the vaccine hesitancy movements that we've seen in the past and what's developing right now in front of our eyes is that there's a lot of actually very intelligent people that tend to believe that there is something amiss here in this whole pandemic story and the situation that we are seeing. The liberties being suspended at certain countries, for instance, freedom of movement, require of having certificate of being vaccinated, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a huge difference, actually, between the guys that believed in some kind of 5G radar control or magnetic field, as you said earlier, and the people who see this as a kind of a threat to the freedom and liberties. So I think that's a difference. Do you see this the same in the United States, actually?
Yes, I would have said 15 or 20 years ago when asked the question, what's the politics of vaccine denialism? I would have said that, or science denialism, I would have said that there is not a politics, that on the left, for example, the liberal side, it's kind of like, all things natural. I don't want to be injected with something that's unnatural. It's sort of the bib overall, gluten-free, bisphenol A-free, dolphin-free crowd, that group, the Southern Californian. And then on the right, it was this, which is the sort of government off my back, don't tell me what to do, the sort of libertarian. But that's not true now. Now it's really all on the right. It's all this sort of don't violate my personal freedoms, don't violate my civil liberties. Well, in truth, it's not your personal freedom to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. That's not a liberty. That's not a liberty that is owed you. I mean, if you step on a rusty nail and go to the emergency department and are offered a tetanus vaccine and refuse it, that's your right. That's your liberty. Because if you get tetanus, no one's going to catch tetanus from you. It's not a transmissible disease. But COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, is a very, very highly transmissible virus. The Delta variant especially is highly transmissible. So your choice affects other people. There's an old Supreme Court justice quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is, your right to swing your fist freely ends at the tip of my nose. And that's true here. You can't make decisions for other people. You can't. That's just not your right to do that any more than you can run a stop sign because you feel like it, because you feel it's your civil liberty. You have to take into account other people in society. You are part of society. You benefit from society, and therefore you have to take into account other people in society.
You're on a mission, Professor. So you are educating actually masses, or at least readers of your books, and parents that are coming to your hospital in Philadelphia about vaccines and about the gains that are being presented by them for the public health. But don't you think that overall what we see here is certain erosion of the trust towards physician? I mean, we see this across Europe right now, in Poland especially as well, that people tend to believe also some other people from their circles, family, but also celebrities. You wrote a book about it. Don't you think it's, in a way, a failure, or if you will, a defeat of physicians in a way, that they are not being respected or at least fully appreciated by certain circles of society?
No, that's right. I think that there is a lack of respect for experience and expertise. I think people believe they can learn just as much as anyone who has experience or expertise by just Googling the phrase vaccines on the internet. It is in many ways the death of expertise. I think it is remarkable to me, and especially in vaccines. I think if you're about to undergo a gallbladder operation, I think it's the rare person who would sort of go online, read what they can, and then go to their surgeon and say, I don't want to do the gallbladder operation the way you want to do it. I want to do it a different way. I don't think people say that. But with regard to vaccines, there's so much bad information out there that's compelling to people that they do believe they know more. They believe there is a belief that they're not getting all the information that they need. They don't trust pharmaceutical companies. They don't trust the government. They don't trust the medical community. They just don't trust it. And I don't know how to get back that trust. I don't understand exactly why we've lost that trust, but we have lost it. I think that's definitely true. We're just another voice in the room.
Maybe the reason is actually what you are describing in your most recent book. The fact is that what you are arguing is that a medical innovation comes with certain cost, and sometimes this cost is deadly. And we've seen this over centuries, obviously, but we've seen this even in 20th century. I think we've seen this even in 21st century, in fact. A lot of things that are being treated as a given, for instance, as heart transplants, were not as obvious in the past. First patient of Christian Barnard died after several days, I believe. There was a very slow development of this particular procedure. And we might not believe this now, but that's the case. So you are arguing in your recent book that there are certain prudent risks that need to be taken in order to develop medicine towards a greater good. So I wanted to discuss in this last part of our conversation about this. What's the reasonable cost that can be bore by the society to move the medical innovation forward?
Well, there's always a cost. And it's hard to answer the question, what is the reasonable cost? Obviously, you'd like to avoid tragedy. I mean, when we invented the antibiotic sulfanilamide, which was a product of the German dye industry, I mean, that was a lifesaver. You know, finally, we had a broad spectrum antibiotic to treat meningitis, a broad spectrum antibiotic to treat bacterial pneumonia. But when it was made in the United States, one of the companies that made it chose to make it for children, to make it palatable. In order to do that, they suspended it in diethylene glycol, which was toxic to kidneys. And when that then product was released in this country, 100 people died, 34 of whom were children. It gave birth to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. You'd like to avoid those kinds of tragedies. But if you look, for example, at today with the vaccines that we have, I think we have avoided it to date. I mean, we do know now that the mRNA vaccines are a rare cause of myocarditis. We know that the vectored virus vaccines are rare causes of clotting, but very rare. And I think the price that we've had to pay for medical knowledge with these vaccines has been a very, very small one. So I think so. That's good. You're trying to avoid the big tragedy. So when Jonas Salk made his polio vaccine, he proved that it worked and that it was safe. 5 companies made it. One company made it badly. Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, failed to fully inactivate poliovirus. As a consequence, about 200,000 children were inoculated with live, fully virulent poliovirus. About 40,000 developed short-lived polio. 164 were permanently paralyzed and 10 were killed. It's one of the worst biological disasters in this country's history, and that wasn't all that long ago in the 1950s. So we're always learning as we go. And that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book, You Bet Your Life, because I wanted people to understand that always happens. And you can't have unrealistic expectations. You can't push forward into the world of medical innovation without learning. And the way that you learn is that there is a human price to pay. That's always true. So expect that. And I think here, the price to pay has been an extremely small one so far. I mean, we'll keep our eyes open, but so far it's been pretty small.
What drives you actually? Why you are writing all those books? I mean, you're still attending active physician, so that's actually a lot of work with patients, with the parents. You are still publishing scientific papers, and on top of that, you're writing medical narratives, which are actually page turners, but that cannot be easy.
Well, I enjoy it. I enjoy the process of writing. I enjoy seeing patients. I mean, I enjoy writing scientific papers. I enjoy it all. So it's not work for me. It's fun for me. I get up early, usually around 4:30 in the morning. I go to bed fairly early, around 9:30 at night. But I'm able to work fairly efficiently, and I have a loving wife who certainly helps me with all this, and so it's been fun. I don't see it as work. Maybe that's how I'm able to do it. I just don't see it as work.
So one last question, because you mentioned Jonas Salk, and obviously we all know how incredible his work was. But you actually had the privilege to work and to meet Maurice Hillman, a little bit unknown figure to many of us, but a person who I think is still responsible for 8 actively used still vaccines in the United States, pediatric vaccines. Are we still having a chance to having a scientist like this developing so many fantastic inventions, or is this thing of the past?
Thing of the past. I think that there will never be another Maurice Hillman. I mean, he was a combination of things. He was brilliant. He was driven. He was hard nosed. But what he did and the reason he could do what he did was he worked for a company, so he had the resources to do what he needed to do. So he could make product after product. He's made 9 of the 14 vaccines we currently give to infants and young children. I don't think his kind of personality would be allowed today. I don't. He was too dominating. I mean, he was, and he wasn't terribly politically correct, which I think would have been a problem. But he sort of also cursed all the time, which was endearing to me, but I suspect was not endearing to everybody. But he was just a unique figure. I don't think there's that combination of brilliance and fortitude and drive. He was never satisfied. Never. I mean, here he made 9 vaccines that we give to children, and that wasn't enough. And when asked the question on his deathbed, really, what's the one thing you regret? He said, without hesitation, I could have done more.
Well, I think that's an excellent finish to our conversation. Thank you very much indeed for being guest of this podcast. And I wish that you recent narrative would sell as good as the other ones. And I'm looking forward to reading this as well. Thank you very much. Paul Offit, professor, pediatrician, and inventor, was the guest of the Extraordinary Stories. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.